Well, hello everybody. Today we're going to be talking about the physical and cognitive development of infants and toddlers. And this is a pretty exciting time. Infancy and toddlerhood, lots of changes are taking place. And what's really happening to make all these changes take place is that the brain is expanding. So the cerebral cortex, which is the outer part of the brain, that's the part that has the ridges and kind of bumps and grooves, is the site, basically, of all of our conscious perception, action, thought, and this influences behavior a few months after birth. And in fact, the brain volume quadruples during the first 4 years. Now, what's happening, it's not as though you're getting new neurons. The neurons have already been formed, but the brain is making lots of synapses, lots of connections with other areas of the brain. The subcortical areas are myelinating, so you're getting a bigger, more connected, more smoother running brain, basically. Let's take a look at this little video on brain development.
The distance a signal must travel determines the axon's length. At a junction called the synapse, communication occurs when a neural impulse at the end of the axon stimulates the release of a chemical neurotransmitter that crosses the synapse to the second neuron's receiving dendrite. Communications continue, and the rate of synaptic formation, or synaptogenesis, increases rapidly into the first year of life. Researchers often describe this growth as exuberant synaptogenesis. Abundant synapses may help with greater flexibility for learning. Their removal or pruning into the childhood years also may help with efficiency and possibly the customization of a nervous system to an individual's life experiences. The process known as myelination increases the speed at which impulses travel along neurons. Myelin is a form of insulation that speeds the transmission of neural impulses. The myelin sheath is formed by oligodendroglial cells wrapping themselves around the axon of a neuron. At 16 weeks, myelination begins in the lower spinal cord and proceeds to the upper spinal cord, brainstem, cerebellum, and posterior part of the internal capsule. All of these structures show myelination at the time of birth. Myelination extends to other areas of the brain and, in fact, continues for many years after birth. The process of myelination is largely complete by the third birthday. By the second birthday, the rapidly growing brain reaches 80% of its adult size. The growth slows and is limited between the ages of 6 and 8 as the bones of the skull fuse. After the bones fuse, the brain's rate of size increase slows further. By age 10, the brain is 95% of its adult size. Around age 18, the brain at its maximum size weighs almost 3 pounds, an enormous increase from its birth weight of about 12 ounces.
So, brain development. As we said, neurons are formed during the fetal period, so all those neurons or nerve cells are pretty much formed prenatally. After birth, the process of synaptogenesis occurs, and hopefully you remember some of this from either your intro or biopsych class, but here's our neuron where we've got dendrites over here, a cell body, a long axon in which a message is sent, and a synapse, meaning that this neuron is sending a message to another neuron. All right, and so all those nerve cells are formed pretty much during the prenatal period, But after birth, we have this process of synaptogenesis, this generation, this growth of synapses. So these neurons are sort of reaching out, the dendrites are reaching out to connect to other neurons around it. And in fact, there's this proliferation of connections. The brain actually produces more synapses, more connections than it will eventually need. And then over time, there is what we call pruning, and pruning is the getting rid of or the degeneration of some of the synapses that aren't used, some of the connections that aren't used. So our brain starts by kind of over-connecting, synaptogenesis, and then pruning back the connections that aren't being used, and so you're ending up with kind of this finely tuned brain. The other process that's happening, myelination, this is the formation of myelin, which we have here covering this axon, which is a fatty layer made by glial cells. Again, maybe remember that from biopsych. Oligodendrocytes in the central nervous system produce myelin, and Schwann cells in the peripheral nervous system produce myelin. And this myelin coating helps messages or action potentials be sent more quickly and more accurately through the nervous system. The myelination in the visual cortex in the very back of the brain is myelinated by about 1 year and kind of works from back to front. And so those frontal lobes, which we'll talk more about in adolescence, are finished myelinating by about 20 or even a little later than that. Neuroplasticity is the idea that the cortex is malleable or changeable, particularly during infancy and early childhood before that pruning process is complete. And so plasticity would allow other brain regions to potentially compensate following very early injury to the brain. Neuroplasticity, and we'll talk about this in a second, is the research that I've done, which is the idea that changes in the brain over the lifespan are able to happen that either have to do with the addition of new neurons, and the addition of new neurons is called neurogenesis. We see that very infrequently, but nonetheless there seems to be some brain areas that do make new neurons over the lifespan, or new connections between neurons, or the reorganization of the information processing areas of the brain. All of that is neuroplasticity. And we see that the brain is less plastic or less able to change or kind of remodel following childhood. So once an adult suffers some sort of brain damage, a head injury, or a stroke, they're often left with pretty significant cognitive and motor issues. The person might have a paralysis on one side of their body. They may not be able to speak. They're often left with pretty significant long-term effects after a stroke in adulthood or brain damage in adulthood. But in childhood, we see much more optimistic outcomes. And that's actually a lot of the work that I've done as in research, and I'm just going to briefly go over this with you. This is work on children who have had strokes, which is very unusual. Many people feel like, what? I've never heard of a child having a stroke, and children can. It's much more rare. And so we study children who have had a single unilateral early onset stroke. What does that mean? One stroke, unilateral meaning only on one side of the brain, either on the right, in the right hemisphere or the left hemisphere, so not both. And early onset, we mean before 6 months of age, so very early on. And then we examine behavioral or cognitive consequences of the damage. And we also follow these children over time to look for continued plasticity or reorganization as the child ages. And so the results from our studies have really challenged, the belief that the brain was hardwired. And this was the belief we had for a long time, that the brain was sort of hardwired and there was not much that changed after about 5 years old. But our results from children has challenged this notion, and that we see a lot of behavioral resiliency after early focal brain injury. So that unilateral, one-sided injury in the very early period. And what we see is that children acquire functioning following brain injury that might leave adults permanently impaired. And so just as an example, this is an MRI. This is a study on a 7-year-old child. And you can see the scan, he experienced a stroke on the left side of the brain, and it's a MCA, middle cerebral artery stroke. You can see it's a very large stroke. The part of the brain that's white is the part of the brain that's damaged. This is a front view. So this is like looking right at the person from the front, and you can see almost all of this left hemisphere is damaged. This is a sagittal view, meaning from the side. We're looking at the left side of this boy's head. This is his eyeball right here. And you can see again how large the stroke was. And then this is a top view. Imagine looking right down at the top. And again, this is white part is all the damage from the stroke. Now, this is such a large stroke on the left side of the brain. The left side of the brain is important for language in most people. So you would expect in an adult, a stroke like this, a person would be left with no language or very little language abilities. We'd also expect with a large left-sided stroke that there would be a right hemiparesis, a right paralysis, probably. What did we find in this child? Well, these are some tests. You certainly don't need to remember these names, but this is verbal IQ. This is verbal IQ, so again, language is average, even though he's missing almost his whole left hemisphere. Self, this is another language test, scored average. Reading, average. Spelling, high average. Now, that's not to say there aren't limits to plasticity. What we see is that this is a performance IQ, so this is a non-language IQ. This is things like putting together puzzles or putting blocks together in a way to make a pattern. He was far below average, and this is a VMI. This is a drawing test. He was below average. So even though it appears the brain has reorganized in some way, because these are the language areas of the brain, and somehow language is being taken over maybe by another part of the brain. We don't know which one. We're not there yet in our research. But it's at the cost of something. And the cost is in visuospatial skills, basically. This child ended up with pretty poor visuospatial abilities. And we see this quite a lot in our research, that the brain somehow reorganizes in a way to preserve language. Language seems to be extremely important. And so the brain reorganizes in such a way as to preserve language. This is another example, and this is a 11-year-old male with a left stroke in the parietal lobe. Again, this is looking forward at the person. Here's the left side view. Again, there's the eyeball, so we're looking at the side. And this is looking down from the top. And you can see the white part is the damaged part from the stroke. And this is a child who had a very major stroke, and these are his test scores. Again, verbal IQ, very superior. Performance IQ, high average. Full scale IQ, very superior. Language testing, very superior. Reading, superior. Spelling, very superior. Drawing, high average. So again, this idea of the children's brains being more plastic, more able to reorganize after early stroke or damage. And so the implications that cognitive functions can develop far away from their intended sites, and that the brain is capable of rewiring during childhood and to some extent during adulthood. All right, back to the newborn. So newborns, while in some ways you can say they really can't do much of anything, they lay there and cry, they also can do kind of amazing things if you think about it. And so one of the ways in which babies are quite amazing is they have these new reflexes that they're born with. Basic newborn reflexes, or infant reflexes. These are automatic responses or actions that are programmed by non-cortical brain centers, meaning the baby doesn't have to think about it. It happens as a reflex, right? We all have reflexes. You've been to the doctor maybe when they hit your knee and your leg kicks up. You're not thinking about it, it just happens. And so there are a number of newborn reflexes or infant reflexes that are present at birth to help promote survival. One of these is the rooting reflex, which is if you stroke a baby's cheek, they will turn their head in that direction. They don't think about it, it just happens. Well, why would that be? Well, if you stroke a baby's cheek, if something's touching the baby's cheek, well, it's usually food, so it makes sense for them to turn their head in that direction. They also have a sucking reflex. If you put anything in a baby's mouth, they will suck on it. Maybe you've, again, have a child or have been around an infant, babysat, have a younger sibling. If you stick your finger in any little baby's mouth, they will suck. It's an automatic reflex. Again, why would that be important? Well, because usually if something is in their mouth, it's food, and so they should suck on that. They also have a grasping reflex. If you put anything in their baby's fingers, they will grasp their hands around it and hold on. Some of these reflexes are very important for survival, some less so, and they do, most of them will go away as the child gets older. For instance, the rooting reflex disappears, right? Because now if someone strokes your cheek, you don't automatically turn it in that direction. So let's go ahead and watch a little video on infant reflexes.
Reflexes like the Palmer grasp, stepping, Morrow, and Babinski are an inborn automatic response, nature's toolkit to help an infant adapt to the world. Many reflexes, breathing, swallowing, and sucking, for example, have survival value. Other more primitive reflexes like the Morrow and grasping are considered leftovers from our evolutionary heritage. Survival reflexes usually become voluntary at some point during the first year, while the primitive reflexes disappear.
Anthony, go back down for a second. So pretty much losing that. So should we draw Oz and the toe goes up and fans out? Just like that.
Some reflexes are predominantly related to the nourishment of the infant. Here, in response to stroking at the corner of Aiden's mouth, we see the rooting reflex. 1-week-old Aiden turns his head and opens his mouth. He roots in the direction of the stroking. This helps the infant find the breast or bottle and begin feeding. Sucking is another reflex that helps the infant find food. Aiden will instinctively suck on any object that is placed in his mouth, including the doctor's finger.
Some reflexes are predominantly related to the protection of the infant. Stroking the palm of Mackenzie's hand will cause her to close her hands and fingers in a grasp. The grasping reflex may be so strong that the baby can support her own weight.
The Morrow or startle reflex is seen when support for the head and neck is suddenly lost, or in response to a loud noise or sudden movement. Here, 1-week-old Aiden throws his arms out and back in response to the doctor's sudden drop of his hands. The Morrow reflex, which should be fully present at birth, begins to disappear at around 5 months of age. Jessipina, who is just 2 months old, has already begun to lose the Morrow reflex. Absence of the Morrow reflex at birth or reappearance after the normal age of disappearance, approximately 5 months, may suggest damage to the central nervous system.
So she doesn't have a startle anymore. It's gone.
Okay.
She's matured and she's overriding that.
Some reflexes, such as the stepping reflex, are related to postural control. When held upright with her feet just touching a flat surface, 2.5-week-old Olivia appears to take steps and walk. This reflex, which typically disappears at around 2 to 3 months of age, will not be seen again until Olivia learns to walk on her own.
Oh, I'm sorry. Let's do that a little better. Let me hold you this way so people can see you. Okay. So, and there like that. She'll start taking some steps. And you can get it to, if you sort of touch the top of her foot, she'll pick up a little bit there, like that.
Reflexes are also used to identify normal brain activity. Absence, persistence beyond the normal time for disappearance, or the reappearance of a reflex later in life is suggestive of significant neurological problems. For example, the Babinski reflex, exhibited here by Olivia when the bottom of her foot is stroked, causes the big toe to flex towards the top of the foot and the other toes to fan out. The Babinski is normal in children under 2 years of age. After 2 years of age, the presence of the Babinski indicates damage to the nerve paths connecting the spinal cord and the brain.
Right. So, newborn reflexes, many of them are temporary, like we said. The rooting, the sucking, stepping, grasping, etc. And they go away when they're no longer needed. We've talked about the rooting reflex to help the infant get towards food. Other reflexes, breathing, sneezing, coughing, blinking, those are needed for a lifetime and they are permanent. And as the video suggested, there are, if you see, basically it seems as though those infant reflexes are hardwired in the brain. And then as the brain develops, it's like the brain develops sort of over those reflexes. They're still there, but the brain develops in such a way that they're no longer kind of able to produce the response. And so then after perhaps brain damage, a stroke, something like that in adulthood, you may see the infant reflex come back. And it's a quick way to test for brain damage. So for instance, if an adult comes in to a hospital, maybe after having a stroke, they might test for that Babinski reflex, which is just running your finger up the bottom of the adult's foot. Now that's a very quick test. It's inexpensive. And if you see the Babinski reflex in an adult, then that's a sign that there's brain damage. If you don't see the Babinski reflex, that's a sign that there perhaps is not. So if those infant reflexes come back in adulthood, that becomes a sign to be aware of that perhaps there's some brain damage there. Some feeding information with infants. Breast milk, nature's first food. There's definitely been changes historically over breastfeeding. It's currently recommended for the first 6 months of life. Breastfeeding appears to protect the baby from diseases and infections, strengthens their immune system. But of course, this is only a correlational study. The research on breastfeeding are mostly correlational studies that show that breastfed babies experience fewer gastrointestinal problems, fewer middle ear infections, are more resistant to cold and flu, and appear to be superior in later measures of intelligence in elementary school. However, these are correlational studies. Remember, we're not able to take people and randomly assign them to breastfeed or bottle feed their babies. And so there can be other reasons why babies who are breastfed are more resistant to cold or flu, or might have higher scores on intelligence tests later on. It may not be just breastfeeding. This isn't a causal study. Remember, you need an experiment to say something about cause and effect. Because there are plenty of challenges to breastfeeding, particularly mothers needing to go to work. If you need to go to work, then it's very difficult to continue to breastfeed your baby. Also, there are cultural attitudes towards breastfeeding, and some cultures are more open to it than others. And some mothers have an inability to breastfeed for whatever the reason may be. And so in those cases, these parents must bottle feed their babies. And so although it's recommended, breastfeeding is recommended for the first 6 months and may be associated with positive outcomes for babies, There are certainly many babies who are bottle fed, and that is just fine. And really every parent, every mother has to do what's right for their baby and their particular situation. Malnutrition, a very serious issue to consider in recent decades. Stunting rates are declining in poor regions of the world, but still affects 209 million children, which is roughly 2/5, 2 in 5 of the developing world, girls and boys. This can be caused by undernutrition, which is a chronic lack of adequate food, and that can lead to different disorders that then can lead to what we call stunting, or an excessively short stature caused by chronic inadequate nutrition. And these are children who are below the 5th percentile in height for their age. This also takes an extremely serious toll on cognition, health, and every activity of life, as you might imagine, right? If children are chronically getting inadequate nutrition, not only does it affect their height, but affects their brain development, affects their thinking skills, affects their health in so many ways, and really everyday life, because they're exhausted, they're tired, and if you're exhausted and tired, then you're not going out to kind of experience the typical situations that children experience, which then causes perhaps the brain not to develop based on those environmental experiences, and it can be a very downward spiral. Okay, we're going to just skip that video and move on to food insecurity in the United States. Even in the United States, there are children who don't have sufficient food. In fact, 1 in 5 mothers report this fear, which is a pretty high number for feeling as though they don't have enough money for food. And severe food insecurity, we have 1 in 10 mothers reporting that in the United States. So there are federal nutrition programs for children. There are food stamps, now called SNAP, Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program. There's WIC, for a nutrition program for women, infants, and children that allow for purchasing certain foods like milk and cereal and breads, and child and adult care food programs. So there are programs available, but even in the United States, there are many children who go hungry and are dealing with malnutrition. All right, how about crying? The first communication signal. Crying is vital to survival, certainly for children. It's the way to get a parent or caregiver's attention, and responsive parenting is a must. If the baby is crying, it's really up to the parent to try to figure out why that baby is crying. It's a reflex. Crying is a reflex for children, and is a clue to the baby's needs. Lifetime peak of crying is about 5 weeks of age, and there's a distinctive kind of change in crying that happens at about 4 months, where parents can start to hear differences in the cry of their baby. Now, colic is a frantic, continual crying during about the first 3 months. I can tell you about this because my first daughter had colic and cried nonstop, and she cried nonstop for 5 months. So if the crying lasts for 3 hours at a time, at least 3 days per week, it might be considered colic. Again, I can tell you my daughter cried pretty much all day, every day, for months. It was not at all what I expected, very difficult as a parent. What is colic? What does it mean? Nobody really knows. The idea is perhaps it's due to an immature digestive system, but there's no absolute answer as to why colicky babies just cry all the time. Certainly colic may contribute to parental stress, because it is very difficult to have a child who does not stop crying, but it is temporary. It's hard to know that when you're going through it. I remember thinking this will never end. My child is going to cry forever, probably till she's 20 years old, but it did end. And so a reminder that it is temporary is very important. How do you quiet a young baby? Crying and quieting undergo developmental changes over time. So what are things that can help? Pacifier, breastfeeding, bottle feeding, swaddling, which is wrapping up the baby in a blanket in a particular way. I have a picture of that in a second to show you. Holding the baby close to the body, infant massage. There are many ways, and they don't all work. And some work at some times and then not another time. But certainly new parents with crying babies are trying to figure this out. I know you do not have to remember all this. This is how to soothe a colicky baby. And like I said, because this is such a stressful time, we're going to talk about sleep in a minute. Babies aren't sleeping through the night. Parents aren't sleeping through the night. And if you've got a baby who's crying a lot, there are so many ideas on how to soothe a colicky baby. I think I tried all of these. None of them worked for me. Maybe they'll work for someone else. How to feed the baby, smaller feedings, how you hold the baby, trying to hold the baby on their tummy a little bit, snuggling on their neck, dancing. I did a lot of dancing, bike pedaling. You can see lay the baby on her back in your lap with feet facing towards you, and then sort of bicycle, arm curls, belly rolls, warm water bottle, tummy massage, a soothing bath. That is the only thing that worked with my child. And so the bath was the only time she was happy and not crying. And I think I gave her 4 baths a day in the beginning. But anyhow, there's lots of ideas, and people will give parents lots of ideas how to get the baby to stop crying. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. There was a very famous book written by Dr. Karp called The Happiest Baby on the Block. He talked about using the 5 S's to try to calm a baby. And the theory is that babies are crying reflexively and that they have a calming reflex as well that can be stimulated with the 5 S's. And the goal is to recreate the sensory input the baby received when they were in the womb. And so you do these 5 things. Shushing, so near the baby's ear, saying shh, shh, which is supposed to sound like how kind of the heartbeat sounds in the womb. Swinging the baby gently in their arms. Sucking is essential, so a bottle or a pacifier. Putting the baby maybe on their side, potentially, or hold the baby over their shoulder. And then swaddling. Here's a picture of a baby being swaddled, which is a tight kind of wrapping of the blanket with the arms around their, kind of wrapped around their, at their sides. So this is another idea on how to stop babies from crying, even though, like I said, some babies just won't stop. Let's see. Crying in infants is their first method of communication. Absolutely. And parents, caregivers have to try to understand why that baby is crying. Let's talk a little bit about sleep as we move into sleep.
Sleep is the essence of life for a newborn. For the first 6 months, infants sleep up to 18 hours a day and are either asleep or in a drowsy state 90% of the time. Sleep is critical for the newborn's physical growth and for the development of their brain and immune system. Most infant sleep is of the lighter REM kind, named for the rapid eye movement that occurs in this stage of sleep. With all that downtime, caring for an infant might seem simple, but a newborn may wake up crying every 3 to 4 hours. This can cause sleep issues for the entire family.
Definitely, it takes getting used to. It's hard to get up at 4 or 5 in the morning, but then, you know, when you see his face, it's just, you know, it makes it all worth it.
Of course, there's a lot more night wakings when babies are first born, but that also decreases rapidly as sleep becomes more consolidated as babies get older. So by 6 months of life, you begin to see pretty strong evidence of consolidated sleep, although it's not really as consolidated as it will be by the end of the second year.
Some infants are naturally better at consolidated sleep than others.
Some children are just, their circadian clocks are stronger or better regulated or bigger, we don't know what. And they find it much easier to deal with regular rhythms, and some kids just have more trouble.
Parent interaction can also influence the sleeping habits of infants.
There are studies that show, for example, that when parents rely too much on contact comfort, and when they soothe their babies to sleep, and when they put their babies down while sleeping, that over time babies come to rely on that to put themselves back to sleep. And so that's a sleep association that's formed, and that they have difficulty going to sleep on their own.
There are many different methods for helping babies learn to sleep well and soothe themselves. It's also important to remember that every child and every caretaker is different. Learning how to balance each other's needs early on will help build healthy, happy, and regular patterns for the future.
All right. Well, okay. So sleeping, the main newborn state. If they're not crying, they're sleeping. If they're not sleeping, they're crying. Newborns sleep about 18 hours a day, and they wake up every 3 to 4 hours. So that can be very difficult in the beginning for parents. And I will say, as I talk through this class about parents, I really mean any caregiver. It can be biological parents, non-biological parents, whoever's taking care of the baby. They may sleep about 6 hours a night by the time they're 6 months old. If you're lucky, that didn't happen with mine. And by 1 year, 12 hours a night and some naps during the day. When all people sleep, their brainwaves go through different stages. So we start with an awake, very awake, active brain, then to stage 1, which is a quieter, more relaxed state. Stage 2, even more relaxed. 3 and 4, you're seeing these slower, deep sleep waves. And then REM, this is a type of sleep where the brain is very active. We think during that time there's a lot of memory consolidation that's happening. And so you can see that babies' time in sleep and type of sleep changes from birth till we've got 90 years here. But in the beginning, right, babies are sleeping 16, 18 hours a day, and most of their sleep is REM sleep. And we think that's important because they are consolidating all of what they're learning during the day, during that time. And then this is the non-REM sleep. Over time, they sleep less, right? The amount of sleep goes less, so that by 1 year they're at about 12 hours of sleep, and you can see the REM sleep has decreased in comparison to the non-REM sleep. And then here's childhood, and then you can see as we get older, people sleep less and less and spend less and less time in the REM sleep stage. What helps a baby self-soothe to go to sleep? Well, there's really this bidirectional influence that sleep deprivation in the household contributes to irritability in both the parent and the infant. So everybody's cranky when there's a baby who's not sleeping. The goal is that by 6 months, when a baby wakes up, they can soothe themselves back to sleep, that they can wake up, maybe cry for a second, and then let themselves go back to sleep. Help themselves go back to sleep. And how do you promote that instead of needing a parent there to help the child go back to sleep? Well, that's a big controversy. There are people who say the best thing is to be very sensitive and respond to a crying infant during the first year. So every time the baby wakes up and cries, you go and either talk to them, touch them, something, be very sensitive, and be there to help calm them and have them go back to sleep. These are attachment types of psychologists who think attachment is really key. And then behavioral psychologists disagree. They think that going in and talking to your baby or rubbing the baby's back is what? Positive reinforcement, right? And so what would a baby learn is that if they cry in the middle of the night when they wake up, they get you to come in and rub their back. And so that's going to lead to more crying when they wake up. And so the behavioral psychologists would say, don't respond to a crying baby. Let them cry it out. Let them learn that they can cry all they want. Nobody's coming in. It's time to go to sleep. And that will help teach a baby to help themselves go to sleep or self-soothe. There's no answer here. There are people in both of these camps, and parents sort of have to choose where they feel comfortable. Co-sleeping, that's an interesting issue, and this is the idea of sleeping in bed with your baby. The American Pediatric Association warns against co-sleeping, but it's still a controversial topic. The American Pediatric Association says co-sleeping makes a child less independent, less mature. It disrupts parents' sleep and children's sleep, and it's dangerous because it can cause a baby to be smothered if a parent rolls on top of an infant during sleep. Even though it is warned against, most parents co-sleep with their babies at least some of the time. There are even special contraptions called co-sleepers where there's like kind of a little crib attached to the side of the bed. If parents do decide to co-sleep with the baby, there are important safety measures to take. Parents shouldn't smoke, drink, or take any drugs that would promote sleep, so they're sort of not aware of the baby being in bed with them. Parents shouldn't be overtired and likely to fall into a deep sleep. The baby should be placed on his or her back with no covers that could fall on the baby's head. No space between the mattress and the headboard where the baby could get stuck. And the baby should be positioned so that he can or she can turn her head toward free airspace. The mattress should be firm, etc. So another controversial topic. It's definitely not suggested that parents co-sleep with their babies, but at some point, almost everybody does at some point, and the key is to be safe. Sudden infant death syndrome, or SIDS, 1 in 1,000 babies in the United States die from SIDS. It's the top ranking cause of infant death in the developed world. We're not really sure what causes SIDS. There's a possible relationship with too few or too many neurons in different parts of the brain. The peak risk time is between 1 and 10 months of age. And so to reduce the risk of SIDS, when an infant sleeps, we place the infant on his or her back. So we always say that there's a back to sleep. That's sort of the key. So you put the baby on their back, and that would prevent maybe a baby on their stomach from kind of suffocating, not getting enough air if their head is turned into the mattress. So on their backs to sleep. We keep fluffy bedding away from the babies, so no blankets even, just dress the baby warm, and no blankets or pillows or anything like that in the crib. Maybe utilizing a baby sleeping blanket basket where the baby's kind of curled up and can't flip around and have anything kind of dangerous around them. All right, habituation. Habituation is a term that as we are exposed to a stimulus repeatedly, our attention is less drawn to it. But when a stimulus is new, our attention is drawn to it. You would have experienced this many times in your life if you're in a library, maybe trying to study, and there's like a certain noise that you keep hearing and your attention is drawn to it. And you're like, oh, that noise is so annoying. I can't stop thinking about it. But then over time, if that noise continues on and on, you stop hearing it. You can focus and it's almost like it's not there anymore. But then if there's a loud noise or different kind of noise, your attention will immediately be brought back. So if you have just been habituated, or you've heard or seen something over and over again and you're basically bored of it, so you're not paying attention to it, you can get your attention renewed by some kind of new idea, new object, new sound, new something. And then we say you've been dishabituated. We can only dishabituate if on some level we know that the new stimulus is different from the preceding stimulus. And the more new or novel a stimulus is, the more we dishabituate to it. Okay, so the more, if you've habituated to a particular sound, right, at that coffee shop where you're studying and you've heard the sound over and over, and then there's a very different sound, like the sound of a car crashing into something in the parking lot, right? That's a very different sound, and you will notice it's different and turn your head. Your attention will be brought to that. We use habituation and dishabituation to study babies. Look at this baby's face. Because we can't ask them, hey, can you see this? Can you see this? Do you hear this sound? Can you tell the difference between these two sounds? So we use this habituation paradigm where we get a baby bored of some object, if it's a visual object or a sound or something, and then we present something new. I'm going to show you this video. Just look at this cute baby. I mean, we got to watch this, right? We won't watch all of it, so don't worry.
If I showed you something that you had never seen before, you would probably look at it for a few seconds. If I then showed
Sorry, let me get to here.
Little bored and look at it less.
Many people are surprised to learn
that even newborn infants exhibit this tendency to habituate to a repeated stimulus presentation.
Let's watch a 2-month-old's
very first experience of looking at a jar of cayenne pepper.
The colors are bright.
The bottle is shiny. It clearly holds her gaze for a while. After about 32 seconds, however, she looks away.
We can plot that on a graph
so you can see how it changes as we repeatedly present this jar.
After she looked away,
I placed the bottle out of her view for about 15 seconds and then showed it to her again.
Here comes the second
time that this little girl ever saw a jar of cayenne pepper.
She looked at it again, of course.
But this time looked away after about 14 seconds.
I hid the bottle for 15 seconds.
And then showed it to her again.
Now she only looked for about
6 seconds.
All right, we get the point, right? Habituation. So this is how we do a lot of research on sensory development in infants, and we'll talk about vision first. What do newborns see? Well, everything they see is blurry, and we use this preferential looking paradigms or habituation techniques to understand what babies can see and what they can differentiate. And so we observe changes in the infant's interest in a stimulus from extreme interest to habituation, like with that cayenne pepper, seeing something again and again, and then finally renewed interest in another new stimulus. So if we showed the baby a jar of something different, and the baby could tell that there was a difference, we would see hopefully habituation. They would look at that new stimulus because it was new to them. So compared to other senses, we see that vision is pretty immature at birth with a visual acuity score of 2400. A newborn would qualify as legally blind in many states, but by about 1 year old, vision is up to 20/20. Babies are nearsighted. They're not able to see things far away. When they're first born, they can see things about 12 inches from their face. Well, why is that important? Because babies are usually being held, and whoever's holding them is about 12 inches from their face. That's really all they need to see. As they get older, their ability to see distances increases. By 2 months, babies are able to see facial features and shift their sight from one object to another. 3 months, they develop the ability to form eye contact with caregivers. And by 4 to 6 months, the baby has developed visual recognition memory of caregivers. Newborns prefer looking at faces than any other stimuli, particularly their mother's face. So if they're given the choice of babies in an experiment, sitting down, looking at these two objects, here's a face and here's a scrambled face. It has all the same features as that face there. They're just in a scrambled position. Babies will spend more time looking at the face than the scrambled face. And this is the preferential looking paradigm. Where do they spend more time looking? They spend more time looking at the face. You will see babies trying to mimic facial expressions. Up until 3 months, they prefer new faces of every ethnicity. And babies start to discriminate between faces of their own ethnicity at about 9 months old. And there does seem to be a particular part of the brain called the fusiform face area that is particularly useful and used for recognizing faces. And there are people who have damage to this fusiform face area and can't recognize faces. So faces are very important to humans and to human relationships, attachment development, and we do even seem to have a particular part of our brain that is specialized for recognizing faces. Seeing depth and fearing heights, for anybody who has a fear of heights, it's about 8 months old when babies begin to perceive differences in depth and start to fear heights. We use this experiment called the visual cliff. You can see this checkerboard pattern that continues there on the floor, and then there's this glass above it so the baby can't get hurt. And here's mom asking the baby, come crawl over. Up before 8 months old, the baby will not even really care about this cliff and just crawl right to mom. But by about 8 months old, they start to realize, wow, this looks kind of dangerous. I should maybe stop right there. And again, about 8 months old, this is when babies are really getting pretty expert in crawling and moving around. And so it makes sense that their visual system is then allowing them to see depth and things that might be dangerous in that particular way. Hearing, continuing on sensory development, hearing develops during the 3rd trimester. At birth, sounds may trigger certain reflexes. A sudden noise will lead the baby to cry. Any new parent knows this. You finally got the baby calm and quiet, and then the doorbell rings, and the baby cries. Babies are especially sensitive to high-pitched sounds, which might explain the preference for high-pitched baby talk. So when people talk to babies, and we'll talk about this in language, they use this, oh, hi, little baby, high-pitched sounds, and babies prefer to listen to high-pitched sounds, again, using that kind of a preferential paradigm. Babies have been found to prefer smooth melodic tunes or lullabies when they try to sleep and relax. They find loud music startling. Well, so do I. Babies find familiar rhythmic sounds like a heartbeat soothing, which is why holding an infant close to the chest may be calming and soothing because they hear your heartbeat. Development of taste and smell. They have a sense of smell and taste that's also pretty well developed at birth, but still gets much further refined before they get to the adult state. Smell within the first week, infants prefer the smell of breast milk over almost anything else, and they can recognize the scent of their own caregiver, which is pretty amazing. Babies' taste buds change throughout childhood into adolescence. There are more sweet taste buds prevalent at birth, and the concentration of sweet taste buds makes sense evolutionarily because breast milk is naturally sweet, and so eating it is much more pleasurable and likely to reoccur, and so that's good because the baby needs nutrition. Infants stop sucking and will wrinkle their face in response to bitter, sour, or salty taste. So we know they can tell the difference between sweet and something else. Sensory development, touch. The sense of touch is pretty acute in infants. Holding, rubbing, cradling a baby is all very soothing. Scientists have noted that babies need to be held. Premature babies who receive extra tactile stimulation grow at a faster rate and leave the incubator sooner than babies who don't receive this extra stimulation. When babies are not held, their growth can slow and they may even be in danger of a condition called failure to thrive. And in fact, I knew a woman, and her job was to be a baby cuddler at the hospital. So for babies who were premature, her job was just to go in and hold those babies and give them that tactile comfort. Swaddling, like we said, wrapping the babies in that special way in a blanket is very comforting to many babies. Infant pain is kind of a confusing point for scientists and researchers in terms of how much pain infants feel. Something that would typically hurt, we can't really tell necessarily if it hurts an infant as much as it hurts an adult. Interesting, even the taste of sugar might be an anesthetic before a newborn medical procedure. Oh, that's pretty cool, huh? If only that was the same with adults. Expanding body size and mastering motor milestones. Newborns, after they're born, lose several ounces in the first 3 days and then gain an ounce per day for months. The birth weight doubles by 4 months and triples by a year. So a 7-pound baby will weigh about 21 pounds at a year old. Body growth is most pronounced in infancy and then sort of slows during childhood. And then you get a growth spurt during pre-adolescence, which we'll talk about at that point. In terms of motor milestones, we see that same type of development that we talked about before. Cephalocaudal, so first they're going to lift their head and move their upper body before they stand, right? So first motor movements in the head area before the legs. Proximodistal, again, the middle, before you have fine control over the extremities, so control of shoulders before arms and fingers. And then mass to specific, we see gross motor skills, so walking, crawling, things like that, before fine motor skills, like being able to do things specifically with their fingers. Here are just some general time frame for when things happen in terms of motor development. So we see rolling over at about 3 months, sitting at about 6 months, standing while holding on to something at 7 months, standing alone 11 months, walking at 12 months, walking up steps at 16 months, and then forget it, they're just off and doing their thing. But you have to remember there's a very big range of what's normal. So even though most children sit by about 5.9 months, there are some children who sit much sooner and some children who sit much later. There's a very wide range of normal. And so that's the idea of variations related to infant mobility, that there is drive. Infants have a drive to do things, and that underlies their motor skills. They're motivated to do whatever they can as soon as they can. There was a traditional view that motor milestones were pretty static. This is what happens. First, babies sit, then they crawl, and then they walk. Now what we're learning is there's lots of variability, there's lots of ingenuity of babies' own efforts to move. There's all sorts of creative ways. There is belly crawling and scooting, etc. And the rate at which babies master their motor milestones don't have any relationship to their later intelligence. Unless, of course, we're talking about some developmental disorders. That's an exception in that. In a developmental disorder, children might have slower motor milestones and lower cognitive functioning. Strength, that babies need to be able to be strong enough to do what they need to do, and so heavier babies may take longer to master these milestones. Maturation and practice is key. All right, here's a cute video about crawling in infants. Oh, she wants to move so bad. Trying to figure it out. Oh, this girl's got it all figured out, right? So now this little one has a different way of getting around. And it works. I don't know what you call that, but it works.
Good boy. You are speedy. Yes, you are. You got good hands, too, then. Can you say it back to Mommy? Here goes your ball. Are you ready? Go get your ball.
So cute. Oh, okay. I'm just going to move over here. All right, into cognitive development. So this is where we're going to start with Piaget's theory of cognitive development. Piaget earned his doctorate in biology in 1918, and at that point most scientists thought infants only ate, cried, and slept. They didn't really think about infant cognition. But Piaget had his own children and was a researcher, a scientist, and he used his scientific skills to study his own children. And he came up with this stage approach that cognition goes through certain stages. So in infancy and toddlerhood, we're in Piaget's sensory motor stage. This is the first 2 years of life, and we will learn about all of these stages, but here in this time of life, we're in the sensory motor stage. Sensory motor stage from birth to age 2, and this is when understanding about the world, so cognition or thinking, understanding about the world, comes from using their senses, right, sensory, and their motor skills, motor, sensory motor, makes sense. So senses, what do babies do to learn about the world? They touch, they hear, they see, they put things in their mouth. And so their motor skills, they grasp, they suck, they chew, and they manipulate objects. All of that is how they learn about the world. One important concept, cognitive skill that develops during this stage is what's called object permanence. At around 9 months, children develop object permanence, which is the awareness that objects and people exist, even if they are out of sight. Brings us to this picture. You mean to tell me you don't go anywhere when we play peekaboo? The idea here is that when a baby who has not developed object permanence doesn't see something, it's as if it doesn't exist. So we often do a test with children, with infants, where imagine they're sitting kind of on their parent's lap at a desk, and and I'm sitting across from them, or a researcher is sitting across from them, and we hold a stuffed animal and kind of move it back and forth, and the baby's looking at it, and it's all very exciting, and then we drop the stuffed animal on the floor. Well, when a baby doesn't have object permanence, they just keep looking at you like, all right, what are we doing next? As if that stuffed animal doesn't exist anymore. But when a baby has developed object permanence, when you drop that stuffed animal onto the floor, the baby looks for it. The baby's looking over the table. They may cry and fuss because they realize that that object is still there. And that's why peekaboo is so much fun for little babies, because when you put your hands over your face, it's as though you've actually disappeared. And then when you say peekaboo and move your hands away, they're like, wow, that's magic. You're actually there. Other keys to Piaget's sensory motor stage is that babies start to manipulate objects to understand what goes on in the world. And so he has these terms, these circular reactions, which is the interplay between sensation, perception, action, and cognition. We start with primary circular reactions from about 1 to 4 months, and these are repetitive habits that center around the baby's body. So sucking their thumb, grabbing their foot. They're learning about the world through these habits that center around their own body. Secondary circular reactions from 4 to 12 months of age. These are repetitive habits that center on environmental objects, like shaking a rattle over and over and over again. Again, by doing that, they're learning about the world, they're learning about movement, they're learning about sound. All of that is happening. And then tertiary circular reactions from 1 to 2 years. These are repetitive habits that center around exploring the properties of objects. So drawing on a wall, unrolling a roll of toilet paper, things like that. You can say that these are when children are little scientists and they're kind of going around exploring. Well, what happens if I do this? What happens if I do that? And kind of making a mess through your house. As a parent and caregiver has to realize this is how this child is learning about the world. Oh, we already talked about objects' permanence. I'm going to actually just go on to critiquing Piaget. His contributions really transform the perceptions of childhood, that infants are actually thinking, they're learning, even though, before then we didn't really think much was happening. He was the first to really give us this idea of what's perhaps going on in these very early stages of cognitive development. Criticisms are that infants can grasp some of these physical realities before age 1. So Piaget gave very specific age cutoffs when he believed certain things happen, and we see that children can complete and have some of these cognitive abilities before perhaps Piaget thought it was possible. And that this understanding of the world develops gradually. So Piaget, and as we continue to talk about the stages, really talks about them in different stages, whereas perhaps cognition develops in a more gradual, kind of like a slope instead of a stepwise fashion. Social interaction, infant social interaction, extremely important. Children are learning social cognition, which is referring to any skill related to understanding feelings and negotiating interpersonal interactions, making inferences about people's feelings based on their actions, and this begins as early as 5 months. What we start to see is what's called joint attention. So this is the first sign of understanding human intentions, when a baby looks at an object to which an adult points, or the infant follows a person's gaze. So if an adult points somewhere and the infant looks to where the adult is pointing, this is joint attention, and this idea that infants are understanding what the adult is asking them to do. The adult is asking them to try to put their attention in some area, and the child is following. And this is the beginning of a social communication. or an infant will follow a person's gaze. If an adult looks in one direction, you may see the child also look in that direction. Again, it's a social communication in its earliest form. This is also after seeing a video sequence, and they do these puppet shows where you've got a kind of a nice puppet, a helpful puppet, and a not nice puppet. Whatever's happening, either they're trying to open or close a box, and one of the puppets is very helpful and the other one is stopping and the puppet from finishing their action. Infants under 6 months of age, preferentially, then the two puppets are put in front of them and they reach for the nice tiger rather than the mean one. So this shows that even at a very early age, there's this understanding of social cognitive awareness, like, oh, that puppet is being nice, that's the one I want to play with, or that puppet is being mean and unhelpful, I don't want to play with that. And it really happens at a very young age. All right, on to language development. Now, how does language develop? There were sort of two competing views here. Number one was a nurture-oriented approach, nurture meaning environment, that language is learned by reinforcement, so that language acquisition follows the principles of reinforcement and conditioning. Think about this: a baby starts to babble and they start to make different sounds. La la ba da mama. Oh, and they say mama, those sounds just by chance. And what does mama do? She comes running to the baby and giving the baby kisses and hugs and saying, oh, you're the smartest, cutest baby in the whole world. And the baby starts to make more sounds. La da ba na ma la ba ba mama. Oh, again, mama heard her name and she comes running over and hugging and kissing the baby. And the baby starts to learn, if I make these sounds, mama, I get lots of hugs and kisses and all sorts of cuddles, so I'm going to keep saying that. And that's the idea of learning and reinforcement, that language is a complex learned skill, that babies imitate others who are speaking. They learn by watching others. Oh, I see that when my big brother says milk, he gets some milk. I'm going to try to say that sound, milk, and then I'm going to get milk. That it's learned and reinforced. And there's evidence to that. We see that children who are abused and lack exposure to language for many years rarely learn to speak normally. Now there's the opposite idea, that language is nature-oriented, nature meaning biology, and that this was first introduced by Noam Chomsky, and the idea was that we have a language acquisition device in our brain. He said there was a hypothetical brain structure that enables us to speak and produce language, and that this is unique to humans. That is why humans have this very complex language and other animals don't. The idea that humans are biologically pre-wired to learn language. What's really interesting about this is that neuroscience research now, because this was many years ago, now we do MRIs and fMRIs, and we actually can see that there are two specific language areas in our brain. We have Broca's area in the left frontal lobe, right here, this orange part that allows us to produce language, to speak. And we have Wernicke's area here in the left temporal lobe that allows us to understand language. So although when this concept was first developed, it was a theory, we really do now have proof that he was onto something. And now, in terms of our current perspective, we have this social interactionist view, that it really is an interaction between the baby and caregivers. Each wants to communicate, each encourages each other. And so there's this emphasis on the social function of language, that we have these parts of our brain that are wired for language, and then we have a social need to communicate. And so the infant and the caregiver are working together to encourage each other to communicate. In terms of language milestones from birth to age 2, you can see that there are different steps that babies go through, starting with cooing at about 2 to 4 months. These are just the first sounds, mostly vowel sounds, ooh, ooh, ooh. 6 to 11 month, this is where you see babbling of vowel consonant sounds, like I was saying, ba, da, la, things like that. 12 months old, you start to see holophrases. These are first one-word sentences. They may not be the perfect words, but parents and caregivers will start to understand what these words mean. Like ja means juice. And so the baby will say ja, ja, and we know it means juice, juice. And then between 18 and 2 years, telegraphic speech. These are two-word combinations. And often an explosion in vocabulary. We call it the word burst around age 2, where they're picking up new words almost every day. Well, every day, and probably many words every day. And so again, me juice, that's a telegraphic speech, like saying, I want juice. So that's the telegraphic speech, first word combining stage. Infant-directed speech from caregivers, that's that infant speech we were talking about that's higher pitched, elongated words, and exaggerated tones that attract a baby's interest. And so almost without thinking, when adults speak to children, they use the specific kind of infant speech. Like, oh, you cute little baby, let me help you tie your shoe, right? High, elongated words. And that seems to help babies as they learn language. Lastly, learning language from an app. Baby products are named to appeal to parents. There's all sorts of products out there. Baby Einstein. Wouldn't you want to buy that because you want your baby to be an Einstein? Jumpstart your newborn's IQ. How could you not buy that one? There's all sorts of apps for tablets and smartphones that are advertised to help language learning. Do these apps work? The conclusion for the research, and this is all fairly new research, is that some educational videos and apps may help older children, but screen time during infancy cannot substitute for responsive, loving, face-to-face relationships. That you really have to be looking at your child, talking to your child. That's how they're going to learn language. Not from a screen, not from an app. Infants are less likely to understand and apply what they learn from apps and videos compared to what they learn directly from another person. So again, while these educational videos and apps may be somewhat educational for older children, in infancy, it's really direct learning from another person. All right, well, we covered a lot. Thank you very much.